The emergency room doors slammed open at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. The woman on the stretcher was barely conscious. Her lips were cracked and colorless. Her skin had the pale gray hue of someone who had been running on nothing for far too long. A small girl ran beside the gurney, gripping the metal rail with both hands, her knuckles white, her feet barely keeping pace with the paramedics. The triage nurse leaned close. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Is there anyone we should call? Family? A husband?" The woman's eyes fluttered. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. "I need a name, sweetheart. Someone who can come be with you." And then she said it. 2 words. A first name and a last name that made the nurse stop writing. Because everyone in Venton knew that name. Everyone knew what it meant. And no one, not in 15 years of emergency medicine, had ever spoken it as a request for help. The little girl looked up at the nurse with eyes that belonged to someone much older than 6. "She's been saying his name for 3 days. She says he's the only one strong enough to stop them." The nurse stared at the child. "Stop who, honey? Who's after you?" The girl did not answer. She simply pressed her face into her mother's shoulder and whispered something too quiet to hear. 30 miles north, in a house with no lights on, a phone buzzed once in the dark. Ashford Memorial sat on the eastern edge of Venton like a building that had been forgotten by the city's ambition. It was a squat brick structure with windows that had not been replaced since 1981, the kind of hospital where the hallways smelled like floor cleaner and exhaustion, where the chairs in the waiting room had been worn smooth by decades of families sitting through the worst nights of their lives. The fluorescent lights above the intake desk flickered every 40 seconds. This was not the hospital where wealthy families came. This was the hospital where you ended up when insurance was a memory and options had run out. It served a population the rest of the city preferred not to see. Overnight workers with no sick days, mothers with no addresses to list on the intake forms, children who knew how to sit quietly in plastic chairs for hours because they had learned that making noise only made things harder. The emergency room itself had 16 beds, separated by thin curtains the color of faded mint. At any given hour, at least 3 of those curtains were pulled closed, around situations that required paperwork no one wanted to file. Overdoses, assaults. The kinds of injuries that came with questions the patients would not answer. Soline Brevard had been placed in bed 9, closest to the back hallway, closest to the exit that led to the parking structure. The attending physician would later note that this was coincidence, but the nurse who admitted her, the one who had heard the name Soline whispered, had made a quiet decision in that moment. She had placed this woman somewhere with a way out, just in case. The child sat in a chair beside the bed. She had not spoken since her single statement at intake. She simply held her mother's hand and watched the curtain as if something might come through it at any moment. As if she had been watching curtains and doors and windows for a very long time. Outside, the October wind pressed against the old windows with a sound like someone leaning on glass, and somewhere in the hospital, someone was making a phone call. Soline Brevard was 32 years old, though the woman lying in bed 9 looked closer to 45. Her brown hair was tangled against the pillow in a way that suggested it had not been properly washed in over a week. Her cheekbones pressed sharply against her skin. The hollows beneath her eyes were the deep purple gray of someone who had not slept, lying down in longer than her body could sustain. The IV in her arm was delivering fluids and a low dose of antibiotics. Her chart noted severe dehydration, early-stage pneumonia, and malnutrition consistent with prolonged food deprivation. Her blood pressure was low, her temperature was elevated. Her body had been pushed past the point of asking and into the territory of simply shutting down. But what the chart could not capture was the way her fingers kept twitching toward the edge of the bed, even in unconsciousness. Reaching for something. Or someone. The reflexes of a woman who had spent so long holding on that her muscles had forgotten how to let go. Her daughter, Kala, sat perfectly still in the chair beside her. She was 6 years old with dark hair pulled into two uneven braids that she had clearly done herself. She wore a coat that was too large for her body, the sleeves rolled up 4 times so her hands could emerge. She had a small backpack on her lap, clutching it with both arms like a stuffed animal, though there was nothing soft about the way she held it. It was the grip of someone protecting something irreplaceable. Inside that backpack, though the nurses did not know it yet, was everything Celine and Kala had left in the world. A change of clothes for each of them, balled up tight to save space. A plastic bag with 4 granola bars and a half-empty bottle of water. A prepaid phone with a nearly dead battery and a single number saved in its memory. $43 in crumpled bills. And a single photograph, laminated and worn at the edges, of a woman holding a baby in front of a house with blue shutters. That photograph was the only proof Kala had that her life had once looked different. The nurse from intake, a woman named Dorrit who had worked overnight shifts at Ashford for 11 years, came to check the IV line at 12:15. She moved quietly. She had learned that certain patients needed silence more than they needed cheerful reassurance. But as she adjusted the drip, Kala spoke. "Is my mom going to die?" Dorrit looked at the child. The question had been asked without a tremor, without the rising pitch of panic. It had been asked the way someone asks about the weather. The flatness of it was worse than tears would have been. "She's very tired and very sick," Dorrit said carefully. "But she's getting medicine now. The doctors are going to help her." "People said that before, about my grandmother. She died anyway." Dorrit paused. She looked at this 6-year-old with the too big coat and the backpack full of everything she owned, and she felt the specific kind of ache that only comes from recognizing something you cannot fix. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Kala." "That's a beautiful name, like the flower." "My mom picked it. She said calla lilies grow even in bad soil. She said they don't need much to survive." Dorrit swallowed. That sounds like something a smart mother would say. She is smart. She kept us hidden for 19 days. She said if we could make it to 21, we'd be safe. "Hidden from who?" But Kala did not answer. Her eyes moved to the curtain again, scanning it with the vigilance of a child who had learned that danger does not announce itself, that it comes through doors and around corners, and sometimes wears a smile. "She told me not to tell anyone," Kala said quietly. "She said the wrong person hearing the wrong thing could end us both. But she also told me that if anything happened to her, if she ever couldn't wake up, or couldn't talk, I was supposed to find a way to say his name." "The name she said when she came in?" Kala nodded. "Who is he, sweetheart? A relative? A friend?" The child looked at Dorrit with that ancient knowing gaze, and then she said something that Dorrit would remember for the rest of her life. "I don't know who he is. I've never met him. But my mom said he's the only man she ever saw scare the devil. And right now, the devil is looking for us." Dorrit stood very still. In bed 9, Celine's lips moved again. The same name. Whispered like a prayer to a god she was not sure would answer. And 3 floors up, in the hospital's administrative office, a night clerk had just finished making a very different kind of call. The kind that paid well. The kind that asked only one question. "Is she there?" The clerk had answered yes. 19 days earlier, Soline Brevard had been standing in the kitchen of a house that did not belong to her, washing dishes that were not hers, in a life she had never chosen. The house belonged to a man named Declan Stroud. He was 51 years old with a wide face that might have been handsome once, before cruelty had settled into its lines like water into cracks. He owned a logistics company that operated across 4 counties. On paper, it moved shipping containers and freight trucks. In practice, it moved other things. Things that required silence. things that required women like Soline to never ask questions and never look too closely at the men who came to the back office after midnight. She had met Declan 3 years ago at a diner where she worked double shifts. He had been charming then, generous. He had paid for her mother's hospice care when the insurance ran out. He had offered her a place to stay when the landlord sold her apartment building. He had smiled and said he only wanted to help. By the time Celine understood what his help actually cost, she was already inside the house with no way out. The first year, he controlled her schedule. The second year, he controlled her money. By the third year, he controlled whether she ate, whether Calla went to school, whether either of them left the property without permission. He had not hit her often. He had not needed to. The architecture of his power was subtler than bruises. It was the way he held her daughter's hand a little too tightly when Celine asked the wrong question. The way he mentioned casually that children sometimes disappear when mothers make bad decisions. The way he reminded her, every single day, that she had nowhere else to go and no one who would believe her if she tried to leave. But 19 days ago, something had changed. Celine had been cleaning the study when she found the folder. It was tucked behind a false panel in the bottom drawer of Declan's desk, the kind of hiding place that only exists when someone has something worth hiding. Inside were photographs, documents, names and dates and transactions that she did not fully understand, but understood enough. Declan Stroud was not just a man who controlled her. He was a man who supplied other men with women who could not say no. And somewhere in that folder, on a page she would never forget, was a photograph of a girl who looked no older than 15. Beneath it was a price. Celine had put the folder back exactly as she found it. She had finished cleaning the study. She had made dinner that night and smiled at Declan across the table and tucked Calla into bed with a story about a princess who escaped a tower. And then, at 2 in the morning, she had taken her daughter and walked out the back door with nothing but the emergency bag she had been hiding in the garden shed for 9 months. She did not take the folder. Taking it would have meant they knew she had seen. Instead, she had photographed every page with a phone she had bought in cash from a pawn shop 6 months earlier. A phone Declan did not know existed. Those photographs were now on a micro SD card the size of a fingernail, hidden inside the lining of Calla's backpack, sewn into the fabric with threads Soline had pulled from her own jacket. For 19 days, she had moved from town to town, paying cash for motel rooms, sleeping in the car when the money ran low, rationing food so Calla could eat while she went without. She had watched her body begin to fail. She had felt the fever building in her lungs. She had known she was running out of time, but she had also known that stopping meant something worse than dying. Because Declan Stroud was not a man who forgave. And the people in that folder, the ones whose names she had photographed, were not people who allowed witnesses to live. On day 17, she had seen one of his men in the parking lot of a gas station outside of Marin County. He had not seen her, but he had been showing her photograph to the attendant. On day 18, she had found a tracker attached to the underside of her car. She had removed it and thrown it into the bed of a passing truck heading north while she turned south. On day 19, her fever had reached 103. Her vision had started to blur. And Calla, 6 years old, had guided her mother into the emergency room of a hospital in a city they had never been to before and held her hand while she collapsed. Now Celine lay in bed 9 with an IV in her arm and a name on her lips. A name she had not spoken aloud in over 8 years. A name connected to a single night when she had been 24 years old and had done something that most people would never understand. She had saved a man's life. A man who, at the time, had been bleeding out in an alley behind the diner where she worked. A man who had looked up at her with gray eyes and said, "Walk away. This isn't your problem." And she had not walked away. She had pulled off her apron, pressed it to the wound in his side, and called the one person she knew who could move a body without involving police. The man had survived. He had never told her his real name, but he had given her a number and said 7 words she had carried with her ever since. "If you ever need me, call this." She had needed him now. And Kala, with the faith of a child who believes her mother's words are truth, had found a way to say his name. The question was whether he would come, and whether he would arrive before Declan's men did. Carrick Vane received the call at 12:23 in the morning. He was sitting in the study of a house that had no name on the deed, in a room lined with books he had actually read, holding a glass of whiskey he had not yet touched. The phone buzzed once against the mahogany desk, a number he did not recognize. A message with only 2 words. Ashford Memorial. He stared at the screen for a long moment. There were perhaps 6 people in the world who knew that number. 4 of them were dead. One of them was sitting in a federal prison and would never speak again. Which left only one. Carrick set down the glass and made a call of his own. "I need a name run. Ashford Memorial, Venton. Female patient admitted in the last 2 hours. Find out who and find out why." He hung up without waiting for an answer. Then he stood and walked to the window that overlooked 3 acres of property surrounded by walls that could not be climbed and gates that did not open without permission. Carrick Vane was 57 years old. He stood 6'3" with shoulders that had not softened with age and hands that had done things no courtroom would ever hear about. His hair was silver at the temples and black everywhere else, cut short in a way that suggested discipline rather than vanity. His face had the quality of weathered stone, hard lines, a jaw that did not move when he was thinking, eyes the color of winter sky, pale gray, almost colorless in certain light, and utterly unreadable. He had built an empire that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal, in the margins where paperwork disappeared and problems were solved without questions. He employed over 300 people across 5 states. He had judges who owed him favors and politicians who feared his silence more than his words. His name was spoken carefully in certain rooms, the way people speak of storms they hope will pass them by. But Carrick had not always been this. Once, he had been a boy named Carrick who slept on a mattress without sheets in a house where the electricity was cut off more often than it was on. Once, he had been a teenager who learned to fight because fighting was the only language his neighborhood understood. He had nearly died twice before he turned 20, and both times he had survived alone. But 8 years ago, bleeding in an alley behind a diner in Venton, he had not been alone. A woman with an apron pressed to his wound had looked him in the eyes and said, "I'm not leaving you here." He had never forgotten her face. He had never forgotten her voice. And when he had given her that number 8 years ago, he had meant exactly what he said. The phone buzzed again. His man had the information. Soline Brevard, 32, admitted at 11:47 with severe dehydration, malnutrition, and pneumonia. She had a child with her, 6 years old. Who brought her in? Paramedics. Anonymous call from a gas station 4 miles east. She collapsed at the pump. Anyone else asking about her? A pause, the kind that carried weight. Someone made a call from the hospital about 20 minutes ago. Internal line. We traced it to a night clerk named Fawcett. He's got prior connections to a man named Declan Stroud. Carrick's hand tightened on the phone. He knew that name. How long until Stroud's people can reach the hospital? 40 minutes, maybe less if they're already moving. Carrick was already walking toward the door. I'll be there in 25. The drive to Ashford Memorial took exactly 23 minutes. Carrick made it in 19. He did not speed because he was reckless. He sped because he understood something most people learned too late. That time was the only currency that could not be borrowed or stolen. That minutes mattered when someone's life hung in the space between one decision and the next. As he drove, he did not think about strategy. He did not think about what Declan Stroud might do or how many men might already be en route. Those calculations would come later, automatically, the way breathing came automatically to people who had never had to fight for air. Instead, he thought about a kitchen in Brennan, Georgia. He thought about his mother. Her name had been Verity. She had worked at a textile mill during the day and cleaned office buildings at night. She had kept Carrick fed when there was no reason food should have appeared on the table. She had kept the lights on through arrangements he did not understand until he was older, arrangements that cost her things she never spoke about. And she had kept his father's rages contained within her own body, absorbing them like a sponge absorbs water, so that Carrick would not have to. He remembered the night he had finally understood what was happening. He was 9 years old. He had come downstairs for a glass of water and found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, holding a bag of frozen corn against her cheekbone. Her lip was split. Her left eye was already swelling shut. She had looked at him and smiled. The smile was worse than the bruises. "Go back to bed, sweetheart. Everything's fine." But everything was not fine. And Carrick, even at 9, had known it. He had known it every night afterward when he lay awake listening to the sounds through the thin walls, the arguing, the crashes, the silence that came after, which was somehow worse than the noise. His father had died when Carrick was 14. Cirrhosis of the liver. The funeral had been poorly attended and no one had cried. His mother had died 2 years later. Not from the beatings, though those had left their marks. From exhaustion. From a body that had simply been asked to carry too much for too long. The doctors called it heart failure. Carrick called it something else. He called it the cost of no one stopping. Because everyone had seen. And no one had done a single thing. Carrick had made himself a promise the day he buried his mother in a cemetery on the outskirts of Brennan with no headstone because he could not afford one. He had stood over the unmarked grave and sworn that if he ever had power, real power, the kind that could change the direction of someone's life, he would not look away. In the years since, Carrick had accumulated power beyond anything that 16-year-old boy could have imagined. He had built an organization that operated on loyalty and fear in equal measure. He had solved problems that police could not solve and courts would not touch. He had become the kind of man whose name made other men careful. But the promise remained. And tonight, driving through the dark toward a hospital where a woman who had once saved his life was lying unconscious with a child beside her and dangerous men closing in, Carrick felt the weight of that promise like a hand on his chest. He had failed to protect his mother. He would not fail again. The hospital appeared through the windshield, a squat brick building glowing against the October night. Carrick pulled into the parking structure and killed the engine. His phone buzzed. A message from one of his men already inside. "Fourth floor clerk has been handled. No further calls will be made. But there is a problem. Stroud's people are already here. 2 men. East stairwell. Moving toward the ER." Carrick stepped out of the car and straightened his coat. He had decades of rage buried in his chest and a debt he intended to repay. And Declan Stroud was about to learn what happened when you hunted a woman under Carrick Vane's protection. Carrick moved through the hospital with the kind of calm that only comes from experience. He did not run. Running attracted attention. He walked with purpose, his coat unbuttoned, his hands visible, his posture communicating to anyone watching that he belonged exactly where he was. The east stairwell was 40 seconds from the parking structure entrance. He reached it in 35. The 2 men inside were not expecting him. They were expecting a woman too weak to stand and a child too small to fight. They were expecting an easy job, a quiet extraction, a bonus from Declan Stroud for efficiency. What they got was Carrick Vane. The first man turned at the sound of the stairwell door opening. He had enough time to register the silver at Carrick's temples and the winter in his eyes before a hand closed around his throat and his head met the concrete wall with a sound like a dropped watermelon. The second man reached for something in his jacket. He never completed the motion. Carrick's elbow caught him beneath the jaw, snapping his head back, and then a knee drove into his solar plexus with enough force to fold him in half. He collapsed against the railing, gasping, and Carrick leaned close. "Tell Stroud that Celine Brevard is under my protection. Tell him that if another one of his men comes within a mile of her, I will dismantle his organization piece by piece, and then I will come for him personally." The man could not speak. He could barely breathe. But he nodded. Carrick straightened his coat and walked through the door into the emergency room hallway. Dorrit saw him first. She was standing near the nurse's station, reviewing a chart, and when she looked up, her face went through 3 expressions in rapid succession: recognition, fear, and then something else. Something that might have been relief. "You came," she said quietly. "Where is she?" "Bed 9. She's stable but weak. The child hasn't left her side." "Has anyone else asked about her?" Dorrit hesitated. Then she nodded toward a closed door at the end of the hall. "The night clerk, Fawcett. He made a call about 20 minutes ago. I don't know to who, but I saw him looking at her intake form before he did it. Fawcett won't be making any more calls." Dorrit did not ask what that meant. She had worked at Ashford long enough to understand that some questions were better left unspoken. Carrick walked to bed 9 and paused outside the curtain. He could hear the soft beeping of the monitors, the whisper of the oxygen line, and beneath it, a child's voice, barely audible, reading something aloud. He pulled the curtain aside. Calla looked up first. Her eyes went wide, then narrow, then hard, with a suspicion that no 6-year-old should know how to feel. She clutched her backpack tighter and positioned herself between Carrick and her mother's bed. "Who are you?" Carrick did not step closer. He remained at the edge of the curtain, his hands open at his sides, his voice low and steady. "My name is Carrick. Your mother called for me. She's asleep. She can't talk to anyone. I know. That's why I'm talking to you." Calla studied him the way a small animal studies a predator it cannot yet outrun, looking for signs, looking for lies. "She said you were strong," Calla said finally. "She said you were the only one who could stop them." She was right. "The bad men are coming. She said they'd find us eventually. She said we couldn't hide forever." She was right about that too, but hiding isn't the only option. Calla's grip on the backpack loosened by a fraction. "What's the other option?" Carrick looked at this child, this 6-year-old with uneven braids and eyes that had seen too much, and he saw something that made his chest ache. He saw himself. The boy who had watched his mother through the kitchen doorway. The boy who had been too small to stop anything. "The other option," he said, "is making sure they can never come for you again." Behind him, the stairwell door opened. Footsteps approached. Not the heavy boots of Stroud's men, but the quick, efficient steps of someone who had been summoned. Carrick did not turn. He already knew who it was. "Sullivan, secure the perimeter. No one in or out without my approval. And find me a wheelchair." "Where are we taking them?" Carrick looked at Celine's face, pale against the pillow, her lips still moving with words she could not speak aloud. He thought about the night in the alley, the apron pressed to his wound, the voice that had said, "I'm not leaving you here." "Somewhere safe," he said. "Somewhere they'll never find." They moved Solene at 1:47 in the morning. Carrick had arranged for an ambulance that was not an ambulance. It looked like one from the outside, complete with markings and lights, but it was registered to a medical transport company that existed only on paper. Calla sat on the bench beside her mother's stretcher, still holding the backpack, still watching everything with those vigilant eyes. She had not protested when Carrick said they needed to leave. She had simply stood up, taken her mother's hand, and walked beside the gurney without a word. She understood, in the way that children of danger always understand, that staying meant something worse than going. The drive took 40 minutes. They left the city lights behind and entered a stretch of country road that wound through hills covered in October fog. The trees on either side were black shapes against a darker sky. There were no streetlights, no other cars, nothing but the sound of the engine and the soft beeping of the portable monitor attached to Soline's arm. Calla watched the window. "Where are we going?" "A house," Carrick said. "It doesn't have an address. It doesn't exist on any map. The people looking for you won't find it." "How do you know?" "Because I built it for exactly this purpose." The house appeared through the fog like something from a story. A stone farmhouse with warm light glowing behind thick curtains. A low wall surrounding the property. A gate that opened only when Carrick pressed his thumb to a scanner hidden in the stone pillar. Inside, the house was nothing like its exterior suggested. The walls were reinforced. The windows were bulletproof glass. There were cameras covering every angle of the property and a communication system that connected directly to Carrick's network. But none of that was visible. What was visible was warmth. A fire already burning in the stone fireplace. A couch covered in soft blankets. A kitchen with a full refrigerator. And a bedroom with two beds, one large and one small, both made up with clean white sheets. A woman was waiting inside. She was perhaps 60 years old with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and a face that suggested kindness tempered by competence. Her name was Margot. She had worked for Carrick for over a decade, and her job was simple. She took care of people who needed taking care of. "The beds are ready," Margot said. "There's soup on the stove. The doctor will be here within the hour to continue the IV treatment." They transferred Soline to the large bed. She stirred during the move, her eyes fluttering open for a moment, and when she saw Carrick standing in the doorway, something in her face changed. Not quite recognition. Something deeper than that. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when a prayer you did not expect to be answered suddenly is. "You came," she whispered. "You called." "I wasn't sure you'd remember." Carrick stepped into the room. He stood beside the bed, looking down at the woman who had saved his life with an apron and a phone call and a refusal to walk away. "I remember everything," he said. Soline's eyes moved to Calla, who was standing at the foot of the bed, still clutching her backpack. "My daughter. Her name is Calla." "I know. We've met." Soline reached out her hand, and Calla came to her immediately, climbing onto the bed and curling against her mother's side like a small animal seeking warmth. "Are we safe here?" Soline asked. "For now. But I need to know what we're dealing with. I need to know who's after you and why." Soline closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there were tears on her cheeks. "I have evidence," she said, "in Calla's backpack. An SD card with photographs, documents, names. Declan Stroud has been trafficking women for years. He supplies them to men who pay for silence. Powerful men. Men who would do anything to keep their names off that card." Carrick's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. The way light shifts when the sun passes behind a cloud. "How many names?" 17. Maybe more. I didn't have time to photograph everything." "And Stroud knows you have this?" "He knows I saw the folder. He doesn't know I photographed it. But he knows that I'm the only loose end, and he knows that if I talk, everything he's built comes down." Carrick looked at Calla, who was watching him with that same measuring gaze. "Mommy said you scare the devil," Calla said. Carrick knelt so that he was eye level with the child. "Your mommy is a brave woman. She did something very dangerous to protect you. And now I'm going to do something to protect both of you." "What?" "I'm going to make sure the devil never comes near you again." Calla studied his face for a long moment. Then she unzipped her backpack and reached into the lining. Her small fingers found the seam where the SD card was hidden, and she pulled it free. She held it out to Carrick. "Mommy said this is worth more than money. She said it's worth our lives." Carrick took the card. It was the size of a fingernail. It weighed almost nothing. But he understood exactly what he was holding. He was holding the end of Declan Stroud and the beginning of something new. The doctor arrived at 2:30 in the morning. She was a woman named Thalia Crane, compact and efficient, with steady hands and a complete absence of curiosity about how her patients came to need her services. She examined Celine, adjusted the medication, and declared that with rest and proper care, recovery was expected within 2 weeks. After the doctor left, Margot brought soup and bread to the bedroom. Calla ate slowly, methodically, the way she had learned to eat when food was uncertain. Celine managed half a bowl before exhaustion pulled her under again. Carrick sat in a chair beside the window, watching the fog curl against the glass, and waiting. At 4:15, Celine woke. Calla was asleep beside her, curled into a small ball with her backpack still clutched to her chest. The fire in the other room had burned low. The house was quiet with the specific silence of the hours before dawn. Celine looked at Carrick. "You stayed. I said I would. You also said you needed to know what we're dealing with. When you're ready." Celine pushed herself up against the pillows. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were clearer than they had been in the hospital. The IV had done its work. Her body was beginning to remember how to function. "I'm ready now," she said. "I need you to understand everything. Not just what Stroud is, what he did, how I ended up in that house. All of it." Carrick said nothing. He simply waited. And in that silence, Celine began to speak. "I met him 3 years ago. I was working double shifts at a diner, trying to pay for my mother's hospice care. She had cancer. The insurance wouldn't cover the treatment she needed, and the bills were drowning me. I was 29 years old, completely alone, and watching my mother die by inches." She paused. Her hands twisted the edge of the blanket. Declan came into the diner every Thursday. He was polite, generous. He tipped well and asked questions about my life in a way that felt like he actually cared. When he found out about my mother, he offered to help. He said he knew people. He said he could make arrangements. And I was so desperate, so exhausted, that I said yes. He paid for the hospice? All of it. $60,000. He never asked for repayment. He just said that when I needed help again, I should call him. And you did. My mother died 8 months later. The landlord sold my apartment building a week after the funeral. I had no savings, no family, no friends because I'd spent the last 2 years working 18-hour days and watching my mother disappear. When Declan offered me a place to stay, I thought I was lucky. I thought I'd finally found someone who wanted to help without wanting anything in return. Her voice cracked. I was wrong. Carrick's face remained still, but his right hand, resting on his knee, slowly closed into a fist. The first 6 months were fine. He gave me a room. He said I could stay as long as I needed. He was kind to Calla. I started to think maybe I could build something again, find a new job, get back on my feet. But then things started to change. How? Small things at first. He wanted to know where I was going, who I was talking to. He started suggesting that I didn't need to work, that he would take care of us. He started controlling when I could leave the house. Then he started controlling whether I could leave at all. She took a shaky breath. By the end of the first year, I understood what I was. I wasn't a guest. I wasn't someone he was helping. I was property. And leaving wasn't an option because he'd made sure I had nowhere to go. No money, no connections, no one who even knew where I was. Did he hurt you? Not the way you might think. He never hit me. He didn't have to. The threat was always there, but it was never direct. It was in the way he looked at Calla when I asked a question he didn't like. It was in the things he said about women who caused problems for him. Complications, he called them. And complications, he said, had a way of disappearing. Carrick's jaw tightened. I spent 2 years trying to figure out how to leave. I bought a phone in cash from a pawn shop. I hid money when I could, a few dollars at a time from the grocery budget. I packed an emergency bag and buried it in the garden shed. And I waited. For what? For evidence. I knew that if I ran, he would find me. He had connections everywhere. Police, lawyers, people who owed him favors. The only way to truly escape was to have something that could bring him down. Something so damaging that pursuing me would cost him more than letting me go. The folder. I found it by accident. I was cleaning his study, and the false panel in his desk came loose. Inside was everything. Names of men who bought women from him. Photographs of the women themselves. Transaction records, dates, amounts. Some of those women were young, Carrick. 15, 16. Children. Her voice broke on the last word. I photographed every page, and then I ran. 19 days ago. 19 days of moving every night, sleeping in the car, rationing food so Kala could eat, watching over my shoulder every second. I knew they were looking for me. I saw one of his men in Marin County. I found a tracker on my car. My body started to fail, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let them take me back. Because if they did, Kala would grow up in that house. She would learn that this is what life looks like, that women are property, that asking for help means giving up your freedom. She looked at her daughter, still sleeping, still holding the backpack. I would rather die than let her learn that. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. The fire had gone out completely. The only light in the room came from a small lamp on the nightstand, casting warm shadows across the walls. Carrick stood. He walked to the bed and looked down at Celine with an expression that was impossible to read. "You saved my life 8 years ago," he said quietly. "You didn't know who I was. You didn't ask what I'd done. You just saw someone bleeding in an alley and decided you wouldn't walk away. Anyone would have done the same. No, they wouldn't. I know because I spent my childhood watching people walk away from my mother. Neighbors, teachers. Everyone knew what was happening in our house. No one did a thing." His voice was steady, but beneath it was something raw. "You did something. You stopped. You helped. And then you asked for nothing in return. You didn't even take the money I tried to give you afterward. It didn't feel right. Because you're not someone who trades kindness for payment. That's exactly why I gave you that number. Because I knew that if you ever called it, the situation would be real. The need would be genuine, and you would have nowhere else to turn." He reached into his coat and pulled out a phone. "Tomorrow morning, I'm making 3 calls. The first is to a woman named Prescott Hale. She's the best attorney in the state for cases like yours. She's going to take Stroud apart legally. The second is to a federal prosecutor I've worked with before. He's going to receive a copy of everything on that SD card, and he's going to build a case that puts Stroud and every name on that list in prison for the rest of their lives. The third call is to someone who handles problems that can't wait for courtrooms." Celine's eyes widened. "What does that mean?" "It means that by the end of tomorrow, Declan Stroud will understand that coming after you is no longer an option. It means that the men who work for him will receive very clear instructions about what happens if any of them ever speaks your name again. And it means that you and Kala will be free. Actually, free. Not hiding, not running, living." Celine stared at him. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do all this for me?" Carrick looked at the window. The fog was beginning to lift. The first gray light of dawn was touching the hills. "Because my mother's name was Verity, and she spent her whole life waiting for someone to stop, for someone to see what was happening and do something about it. She died waiting." He turned back to Celine. "You're not going to die waiting. I won't allow it." By 9 o'clock the following morning, Carrick had made his calls. Prescott Hale arrived at the farmhouse at 11:15. She was a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and sharper instincts. She had built her reputation on cases that seemed impossible, on clients that other attorneys had abandoned, on victories that the legal establishment said could not be won. She sat across from Celine at the kitchen table and listened to everything. She took notes in a leather journal. She asked questions that were precise and specific. And when Celine finished, Prescott closed the journal and looked at her with an expression that contained neither pity nor doubt. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "I'm filing an emergency protective order today. By this afternoon, there will be a legal barrier between you and Stroud that carries criminal penalties if he violates it. Tomorrow, I'm filing for full custody of Calla and a restraining order that covers not just Stroud, but every known associate. Within the week, I'll have the trafficking charges prepared and ready to submit to the federal prosecutor." Will it work? The evidence on that SD card is comprehensive. Names, dates, photographs, transaction records. This isn't circumstantial. This is documentation of a criminal enterprise. Stroud's lawyers will try to suppress it, but they won't succeed. The chain of custody is clean, and the victims on those pages deserve justice. What about the men on the list? The ones who bought from him? Prescott's eyes hardened. They're going down too. Every single one. Some of them have power. Some of them have connections. But none of them have what I have. What's that? Evidence. And a client who's willing to testify. Celine looked at Calla, who was sitting on the couch near the fire, drawing pictures on a pad of paper Margot had given her. The child was drawing a house. 4 walls. A triangle roof. 2 windows. A door. And inside the door, 3 figures. A tall one and a small one and an even smaller one. "I'll testify," Celine said. "Whatever it takes. I'll stand in front of a courtroom and tell them everything. You won't have to do it alone. We'll prepare you. We'll protect you. And when it's over, those men will never hurt another woman again." The federal prosecutor called at 2 o'clock. His name was Dashiell Varn, and he had a voice like gravel wrapped in silk. He had worked with Carrick before on matters that required discretion and resulted in convictions. He was not a man who asked unnecessary questions. "I've reviewed the preliminary material," he said. "This is exactly what we've been looking for. Stroud has been on our radar for years, but we've never had anyone willing to come forward. Your witness changes everything." "She's not just a witness," Carrick said. "She's the reason this case exists. Treat her accordingly." "Understood. I'm assigning a protective detail to supplement whatever arrangements you've made. The marshals will coordinate with your people. Keep them at a distance. She's been hunted for 3 weeks. She doesn't need more men with guns making her feel trapped. I'll make sure they understand." The third call, the one Carrick made alone from the study while the others were occupied, was shorter. "Stroud," he said. "This is Carrick Vane." A pause. When Stroud spoke, his voice was controlled, but beneath it was the specific tension of a man who had just realized he was not the predator in this conversation. "Vane, I don't know what you think you're involved in, but this is a private matter. The woman took something that belongs to me. The woman is not property. The child is not property. And what they took is evidence that will put you in a cell for the rest of your life. You're making a mistake. No, you made the mistake. 3 years ago, when you decided to trap a woman who had shown kindness to the wrong man, or the right man, depending on your perspective." Silence. "Here's what's going to happen," Carrick continued. "In the next 48 hours, federal prosecutors are going to receive comprehensive documentation of your trafficking operation. They're going to receive the names of every man who ever purchased from you. And they're going to receive a witness willing to testify to everything she saw in your house. That witness won't live long enough to testify. She will, because as of this moment she's under my protection. And you know what that means." More silence, heavier this time. "If any of your men come within 100 miles of her, I will dismantle everything you've built. Your business, your accounts, your properties, your connections. I will take apart your life piece by piece, and when there's nothing left, I will come for you personally, not to kill you. That would be too quick. I'll make sure you spend the rest of your life in a federal prison, watching the walls close in, knowing that a woman you thought was powerless is the reason you lost everything. Stroud's breathing had changed. Faster, less controlled. You don't want this war, Vane. You're right. I don't. But I'm willing to fight it. The question is whether you are. Carrick hung up. When he returned to the main room, Celine was sitting on the couch with Calla beside her. The child was showing her the drawing she had made. The house with 3 figures inside. Celine looked up at Carrick. Is it done? It's beginning. The legal process will take months. But Stroud knows the cost of continuing. He knows what happens if he comes for you. And if he decides the cost is worth it? Carrick looked at Calla's drawing, at the 3 figures standing in a house that had a door. Then he'll discover that some costs are higher than he can pay. The weeks that followed moved like water finding its path down a hillside, slowly at first, then faster, then unstoppable. Prescott Hale filed the emergency protective order on a Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, Declan Stroud had been served at his home by federal marshals who did not smile and did not leave until he had signed the acknowledgement. The order prohibited him from contacting Celine or Calla directly or indirectly. It prohibited his associates from approaching them. It prohibited any attempt to discover their location through third parties. The violation of any provision carried a minimum sentence of 5 years. By the end of the first week, the federal prosecutor had convened a grand jury. Dashiell Varn presented the evidence from the SD card methodically, document by document, photograph by photograph. The 17 names on Stroud's list included 2 state legislators, a retired federal judge, and the CEO of a company that appeared on the Fortune 500. The grand jury returned indictments on all counts. Stroud was arrested at 6:15 on a Friday morning. The footage appeared on every news channel by noon. A man in handcuffs being led from a house in the wealthy part of Venton, his face a mask of controlled fury, his lawyers already shouting about violations of process. The process, as it turned out, was airtight. By the end of the second week, 3 of the 17 men on the list had turned state's evidence. They provided additional documentation. They named other names. They described the network in detail, and the network was larger than anyone had imagined. It stretched across state lines. It involved shell companies and offshore accounts, and a web of complicity that had remained hidden for over a decade. The women who had been trafficked, the ones who were still alive, began to come forward. First 2, then 7, then 19. Each one told a story that echoed Celine's. Isolation, control, the systematic removal of every option except compliance. Prescott Hale took 12 of those cases pro bono. She built a coalition of attorneys across 5 states. She gave interviews on national television that were careful and precise, and devastating in their clarity. By the end of the 3rd week, Declan Stroud's empire had collapsed. His assets were frozen. His properties were seized. His lawyers abandoned him one by one as the scope of the evidence became clear. He sat in a federal detention facility awaiting trial, and the men who had once done his bidding disappeared into the margins of society, unwilling to be associated with a name that had become synonymous with predation. The trial took 4 months. Celine testified on a Thursday in February, her voice steady, her hands folded in her lap, her daughter sitting in the front row of the gallery with Margot beside her. She told the jury everything: the isolation, the control, the folder with the photographs, the 19 days of running. The night she collapsed in a gas station parking lot and told her daughter to say a name that had been her only hope. The defense tried to discredit her. Prescott Hale destroyed them. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Declan Stroud was sentenced to 47 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. The 17 men on his list received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The network was dismantled. The shell companies were dissolved. The offshore accounts were seized and distributed to the victims. On the day of sentencing, Soline stood outside the federal courthouse with Kala's hand in hers. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. But Celine looked past all of them to a black car idling at the edge of the parking lot. The window was down. Carrick Vane sat inside, watching. She raised her hand. Not a wave. Just an acknowledgement. He nodded once. Then the window rose and the car pulled away, and Celine Brevard turned to face the rest of her life. 6 months after the trial ended, Celine and Kala moved into a small house on the outskirts of a town called Pemberton Falls. It was not a grand house. It had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with a window that looked out onto a yard with a single apple tree, and a front porch with a swing that creaked when the wind blew. The paint was white with blue shutters. The door was red, and the deadbolt was heavy and solid and turned with a satisfying click that Kala loved to hear. The house had been purchased through a trust that Prescott Hale had established. The payments came from a fund created by the seizure of Stroud's assets, money redistributed to the women whose lives he had taken and twisted. It was not charity. It was restitution. And Celine had accepted it without shame, because she understood now what she had not understood for so many years. Accepting help was not weakness. Accepting help was what made survival possible. Kala started 2nd grade at the elementary school 3 blocks away. She walked there every morning with her backpack, which no longer contained emergency supplies and hidden evidence, but lunch and homework, and a small stuffed rabbit that Margot had given her before they left the farmhouse. She made friends, a girl named Britta who liked to draw, a boy named Oren who collected interesting rocks. She laughed more than she had in years. And sometimes, when she came home from school, she would find her mother sitting on the porch swing, reading a book, not looking over her shoulder, not flinching at sounds, just existing, being normal. On a Saturday in October, exactly 1 year after the night in the hospital, Celine took Kala to breakfast at a small diner in the center of town. It was called Pemberton's, and it had red vinyl booths and a bell above the door and coffee that was always slightly too strong. They sat in a booth by the window. Kala ordered pancakes. Celine ordered eggs and toast and ate all of it without wrapping anything in a napkin for later. "Mom," Kala said between bites, "can we come here every Saturday?" "If you want." "I want." Kala looked around the diner at the families at other tables, at the waitress calling everyone Han, at the cook visible through the kitchen window flipping something on the griddle. Then she pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket and slid it across the table. "I made this in art class," she said. "It's for you." Celine unfolded the paper. It was a drawing, done in crayon and colored pencil, of a house with white walls and blue shutters and a red door. In front of the house stood 2 figures, a tall one with brown hair, a small one with braids. Above them, in careful purple letters, Kala had written a single word: safe. Celine pressed the drawing to her chest. She closed her eyes, and she felt something that had been clenched inside her for years, maybe her whole life, slowly and finally begin to release. She reached across the table and held her daughter's hand. "I love you," she said. "I know," Kala said. "You show me every day." Outside the diner, a black car had parked at the edge of the lot. Inside it, Carrick Vane sat with the engine off, watching through the window. He could see the shapes of a woman and a child in a corner booth. He could see the child holding something up, a piece of paper. He could see the woman press it to her heart with both hands. He did not know what the paper said, but he understood what it meant. He thought about his mother, about the kitchen in Brennan, Georgia, about the frozen corn against her cheekbone and the smile that was worse than the bruises. He thought about the promise he had made at her unmarked grave, the promise to never look away, to never be the one who saw and did nothing. He had kept that promise. He thought about the night in the alley, 8 years ago, when a woman with an apron had pressed it to his wound and said, "I'm not leaving you here." He had given her a number and told her to call if she ever needed him. She had called, and he had answered. Some debts could only be repaid with action. He had repaid his. He started the engine. The car pulled out of the lot slowly, passing the diner window. For a moment, just a moment, he thought he saw Celine look up. He thought he saw her hand raised slightly, a gesture so small it might have been nothing. He nodded, though she could not see it. Then he drove away, into the October morning, leaving behind a diner with red vinyl booths, and a woman who no longer had to run, and a child who had finally learned what the word safe actually meant. In Pemberton Falls, the leaves were changing color. Gold and red and orange, falling softly to the ground like small surrenders. The air smelled like wood smoke and apples and the particular sweetness of autumn in a town where nothing terrible was waiting around the corner. And in a small house with white walls and blue shutters and a red door, a deadbolt waited faithfully in its locked position, not because danger was coming, but because the woman who lived there had earned the right to lock her own door, to choose who entered, to decide finally and forever that this was her home, that this was her life, that she was free.